What if the sins we quietly excuse are just as serious as the sins we openly condemn? Think about that for a moment. Most people would say murder is worse than lying, abuse is worse than gossip, betrayal is worse than jealousy. But then you open the Bible, and suddenly things become complicated, because the same scriptures that condemn violence also warn about pride, greed, envy, hatred, lust, and even careless words. So are all sins actually equal in God's eyes, or are some sins truly worse than others? And if every sin separates us from God, what does that mean for ordinary people trying to live good lives? Tonight, we're exploring one of Christianity's most debated and uncomfortable questions. Are all sins equal? Welcome to Sacred Questions. This question matters because it changes how we see justice, forgiveness, other people, and ourselves. For many Christians, the phrase, all sins are equal, is something they've heard their entire lives. Usually, the idea comes from verses like James 2:10, which says, "Whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it." That's a powerful statement. It suggests that sin is not merely about ranking bad behavior on a human scale, it's about rebellion against God. In other words, even what we call a small sin still damages our relationship with a holy God. And honestly, that can feel shocking because human beings naturally rank sins. We see some actions as monstrous and others as minor flaws. A lie is not the same as genocide. Stealing a candy bar is not the same as murder. Even the legal systems of nearly every country recognize degrees of wrongdoing. So when Christians say all sins are equal, many people immediately push back because it sounds morally absurd. But here's where the conversation gets deeper. The Bible never actually says all sins are identical in consequence, damage, or seriousness. What many theologians argue instead is that all sins are equal in one specific sense. Every sin separates humanity from God. Whether it's pride or violence, dishonesty or cruelty, sin fractures something sacred. And from that perspective, no one can claim moral perfection before God. Not the criminal, not the religious leader, not the ordinary person. Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." All, not just some. That verse completely destroys the comforting illusion that bad people are the only sinners. Christianity teaches that sin is universal. But at the same time, the Bible also seems to suggest that some sins are worse than others, and this is where things become really interesting. In the Gospel of John, Jesus tells Pontius Pilate, "The one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." A greater sin. That language implies degrees. In Ezekiel, some sins provoke stronger judgment than others. In the Old Testament law, punishments varied depending on the offense. And in the New Testament, Jesus warns that certain cities will face harsher judgment because they rejected greater truth. So biblically speaking, there appears to be both equality and inequality when it comes to sin. Equal in the sense that all humans need grace. Unequal in the sense that some sins cause deeper destruction, greater suffering, and heavier accountability. And maybe that tension actually reflects reality better than either extreme, because we instinctively know some actions are more devastating than others. A hateful thought is not the same as acting on violence, but we also know how seemingly small sins can grow. Pride becomes cruelty, jealousy becomes betrayal, bitterness becomes hatred, lies become corruption. The Bible often treats sin less like isolated mistakes and more like a condition spreading through the human heart. That idea can be uncomfortable because it shifts the focus away from simply identifying worse people. Instead, it forces us to examine ourselves. And honestly, that may be one reason Jesus spoke so harshly about hypocrisy. Again and again, he challenged religious people who publicly condemned obvious sinners while ignoring pride, greed, judgment, and self-righteousness within themselves. In fact, some of Jesus' strongest words were directed not at criminals, but at religious leaders. That surprises many people. Because we tend to imagine sin mainly as outward behavior, but Christianity also emphasizes inward transformation, not just what we do, but who we become. Now, critics of Christianity often raise an important objection here. If all sins separate people from God, doesn't that create a dangerous moral equivalence? Doesn't it unfairly compare ordinary human weakness with horrific evil? That concern deserves to be taken seriously. And many theologians would agree that Christians should never minimize terrible acts by flattening every sin into the exact same category. The suffering caused by abuse, violence, exploitation, or oppression is real and profound. The Bible itself acknowledges that reality. Sin has consequences, spiritually, emotionally, socially, and physically. Some sins destroy families, some destroy nations, some destroy lives. So saying all sins are equal without explanation can become misleading. But there's another side to this conversation that is equally important. Human beings are often very skilled at condemning visible sins while excusing invisible ones. We judge the addict while nurturing greed. We condemn corruption while feeding pride. We criticize hatred while refusing forgiveness. And that may be part of the deeper spiritual warning Christianity tries to communicate. Not that every action causes identical harm, but that every human heart is capable of darkness. That realization is humbling, because it removes the comforting distance between us and them. Suddenly, sin is not just a problem out there in the world. It's also inside us. And perhaps that's why Christianity places such enormous emphasis on grace. If salvation depended on moral superiority, who could honestly stand before God with confidence? Who could claim complete purity of thought, motive, and action? This is where the Christian message becomes radically different from simple moral scorekeeping. The center of Christianity is not the idea that some people are good enough and others are too sinful. The center is the belief that all people need mercy. That doesn't erase justice. It doesn't eliminate accountability. And it certainly doesn't mean evil should be ignored. But it does mean no one stands above the need for forgiveness. And maybe that's the hardest truth of all. Because most of us prefer comparisons. We want to believe we are better than someone else, safer than someone else, more righteous than someone else. But Christianity repeatedly confronts human pride with a deeply uncomfortable message. Before God, no one is completely innocent. So, are all sins equal? Not exactly. The Bible suggests different sins carry different consequences, levels of damage, and degrees of accountability. But Christianity also teaches that every sin, even the ones society considers small, reveals humanity's need for grace. And maybe the real danger is not merely committing obvious sins. Maybe it's becoming so confident in our own goodness that we stop recognizing our need for mercy at all. That's the question. What do you think? Are all sins equal in God's eyes? Or does Christianity sometimes oversimplify this issue? I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy thoughtful conversations about faith, doubt, God, morality, and the hardest questions in Christianity, subscribe to Sacred Questions and join us for the next discussion. Because some questions are too important to ignore, and sometimes the uncomfortable questions lead us closer to the truth.